Someone has remarked that witchcraft came into England with the Stuarts and went out with them. This offhand way of fixing the rise and fall of a movement has just enough truth about it to cause misconception. Yet so much was the movement accelerated, such additional impetus was given it by James I, that the view that James set the superstition going in England, however superficial, has some truth in it. If Elizabeth had ever given the matter thought, she had not at least given it many words. James had very definite opinions on the subject and hesitated not at all to make them known. His views had weight. It is useless to deny that the royal position swayed the courts. James's part in the witch persecution cannot be condoned, save on the ground that he was perfectly honest. He felt deeply on the matter. It was little wonder. He had grown up in Scotland in the very midst of the witch alarms. His own life, he believed, had been imperiled by the machinations of witches. He believed he had every reason to fear and hate the creatures, and we can only wonder that he was so moderate as we shall later find him to have been. The story of the affair that stirred up the Scottish king and his people has often been told, but it must be included here to make his attitude explicable. In 1589 he had arranged for a marriage with the Princess Anne of Denmark. The marriage had been performed by proxy in July, and it was then provided that the princess was to come to England. She set out, but was driven onto the coast of Norway by a violent storm, and detained there by the continuance of the storms. James sailed to Uppsala, and, after a winter in the north of the continent, brought his bride to Scotland in the spring, not without encountering more rough weather. To the people of the time it was quite clear that the ocean was unfriendly to James's alliance. Had Scotland been ancient Greece, no doubt Neptune would have been propitiated by a sacrifice. But it was Scotland, and the ever-to-be-feared Satan was not so easily propitiated. He had been very active of late in the realm. Moreover, it was a time when satanic and other conspiracies were likely to come to light. The kingdom was unsettled, if not discontented. There were plots, and rumors of plots. The effort to expose them, as well as to thwart the attacks of the evil one on the king, led to the conception and spread of the monstrous story of the conspiracy of Dr. Fian. Dr. Fian was nothing less than a Scottish Dr. Faustus. He was a schoolmaster by profession. After a dissolute youth he was said to have given soul to the devil. According to the story he gathered around him a motley crowd, Catholic women of rank, wise women, and humble peasant people, but it was a crew ready for evil enterprise. It is not very clear why they were supposed to have attacked the king, perhaps because of his well-known piety, perhaps because he was a Protestant. In any case they set about, as the story went, to destroy him, and thought to have found their opportunity in his trip to Denmark. They would drown him in a storm at sea. There was a simple expedient for raising a storm, the throwing of cats into the sea. This Scottish method of sacrificing to Neptune was duly carried out, and, as we have seen, just fell short of destroying the king. It was only the piety of the king, as Dr. Fian admitted in his confession, that overmatched the power of his satanic majesty. Such is the story that stirred Scotland from end to end. It is a story that is easily explained. The confessions were wrung from the supposed conspirators by the various forms of torture lately provided for witches in that country. Garlice Duncan had been tried with the torture of the pillywinks upon her fingers, which is a grievous torture, and binding or wrenching her head with a cord or rope. Agnes Sampson had suffered terrible tortures and shameful indignities until her womanly modesty could no longer endure it, and she confessed whatsoever was demanded of her. Dr. Fian was put through the ordinary forms of torture and was then put to the most severe and cruel pain in the world, called the boots, and thereby was at length induced to break his silence and to incriminate himself. At another time, when the king, who examined him in person, saw that the man was stubborn and denied the confessions already made, he ordered him to be tortured again. His fingernails were pulled off with a pair of pincers, and under what was left of them needles were inserted up to the heads. This was followed by other tortures too terrible to narrate. It is a little hard to understand how it was that the king took great delight to be present at the examinations, but throughout the whole wretched series of trials he was never wanting in zeal. When Barbara Napier, sister-in-law to the Laird of Carshogill, was to be executed, a postponement had been granted on account of her pregnancy. Afterwards, nobody insisting in the pursuit of her, she was set at liberty. It seems also that the jury that had before condemned her had acquitted her of the main charge, that of treasonable witchcraft against the king. The king was angered at the default of justice, and made an address on the subject. He spoke of his own impartiality, the use of witchcraft, the enormity of the crime, the ignorance of thinking such matters mere fantasies, the cause of his own interference in the matter, the ignorance of the assizes in the late trial, his own opinion of what witches really are. It was only a few years later that James put that opinion into written form. All the world knows that the king was a serious student. With unremitting zeal he studied this matter, and in 1597, 7 years after the Dr. Fian affair, he published his Daemonology. It was expressly designed to controvert the
damnable opinions of two principally our age. Reginald Scott, who is not ashamed in public print to deny that there can be such a thing as witchcraft, and Wierus, a German physician, who sets out a public apology for all these craft folks whereby he plainly betrays himself to have been one of that profession.
It was to be expected that James would be an exponent of the current system of belief. He had read diligently, if not widely, in the continental law of the subject and had assimilated much of it. He was Scotch enough to be interested in theology and Stuart enough to have very definite opinions. James had, too, his own way of putting things. There was a certain freshness about his treatment, in spite of the fact that he was ploughing old fields. Nothing illustrates better his combination of adherence to tradition, of credulity, and of originality than his views on the transportation of witches, a subject that had long engaged the theorists in demonology. Witches could be transported, he believed, by natural means, or they could be carried through the air by the force of the Spirit which is their conductor, as Habakkuk was carried by the angel. This much he could accept. But that they could be transformed into a little beast or fowl and pierce through whatsoever house or church, though all ordinary passages be closed, this he refused to believe. So far, however, there was nothing original about either his belief or his disbelief. But his suggestion on another matter was very probably his own. There had been long discussion as to how far through the air witches could go. It was James's opinion that they could go only so far as they could retain their breath. But it was seldom that the royal demonologist wandered far from the beaten road. He was a conformist and he felt that the orthodox case needed defense, so he set about to answer the objectors to the argument that it was a strange thing that witches were melancholy and solitary women, and so, he would have explained, offer the easiest object of attack, he interposed a flat denial.
They are some of them rich and worldly wise, some of them fat or corpulent in their bodies.
To the point that if witches had the power ascribed to them no one but themselves would be left alive in the world, he answered that such would be the case, were not the power of the devil bridled by God. To the plea that God would not allow his children to be vexed by the devil, he replied that God permits the godly who are sleeping in sin to be troubled, that he even allows the evil one to vex the righteous for his own good, a conventional argument that has done service in many a theological controversy. It is a curious circumstance that James seemingly recognized the reliability of the Catholic exorcisms which the Church of England was about that time beginning to attack. His explanation of them is worthy of the wisest fool in Christendom.
The papists may often effect cures of the possessed because the devil is content to release the bodily hurting of them, thereby to obtain the perpetual hurt of the souls.
That James should indulge in religious disquisitions rather than in points of evidence was to be expected. Although he had given up the Scottish theology, he never succeeded in getting it thoroughly out of his system. As to the evidence against the accused, the royal writer was brief.
Two sorts of evidence are of value, one the finding of their mark, and the trying the insensibility thereof, the other is their floating on the water. The latter sign is based on the fact that the water refuses to receive a witch. That is to say, the pure element would refuse to receive those who had renounced their baptism.
A critical estimate of James's book it is somewhat hard to give. Students of witchcraft have given utterance to the most extravagant but widely divergent opinions upon it. His work corresponded with the times in which it was written. Here is a specimen of its contents.
The devil teaches witches how to make pictures of wax and clay, that by the roasting thereof, the persons that they bear the name of, may be continually melted or dried away by continual sickness, not that any of these means which he teacheth them, except poisons, which are composed of things natural, can of themselves help any to these turns they are employed in. That witches can bewitch, and take the life of men or women by roasting of the images which is very possible to their master to perform, for although that instrument of wax have no virtue in the turn doing, yet may he not very well, by that same measure that his conjured slave melts that wax at the fire, may he not, I say, at these same times, subtly as a spirit, so weaken and scatter the spirits of life of the patient, as may make him on the one part for faintness to sweat out the humours of his body, and on the other part, for the not concurring of these spirits which cause his digestion, so debilitate his stomach, that his humour radical continually sweating out on the one part, and no new good suck being put in the place thereof for lack of digestion on the other, he at last shall vanish away even as his picture will do at the fire.
Even royal nonsense may sometimes be necessary upon historical points, and we must listen to their incoherent jargon, however much we hold them in contempt. So good an authority as Thomas Wright has declared that it is much inferior to the other treatises on the subject, and that it was compiled from foreign works. Yet one gets the impression, from what may be learned of that great body of writing through the historians of witchcraft, that James's opinions were in some respects his own. He had absorbed the current belief, but he did not hesitate to give his own interpretation and explanation of phenomena. That interpretation is not wanting in shrewdness. It seems to one who has wandered through many tedious defences of the belief in witchcraft that James's work is as able as any in English prior to the time of Joseph Glanville in 1668. One who should read Glanville and James together would get a very satisfactory understanding of the position of the defenders of the superstition. Glanville insisted upon what he believed were well-authenticated facts of experience. James grounded his belief upon a course of theoretical reasoning. James's book was influential in its time. It goes without saying that his position as a sovereign greatly enhanced its influence. This was particularly true after he took the throne of England. The dicta that emanated from the executive of the English nation could not fail to find a wide audience, and especially in England itself. His work offered a textbook to officials. It was a key to the character and methods of the new ruler, and those who hoped for promotion were quick to avail themselves of it. To prosecute witches was to win the sovereign's approval. The judges were prompted to greater activity. Moreover, the sanction of royalty gave to popular outbreaks against suspicious women greater consideration at the hands of the gentry. And it was in the last analysis the gentry, in the persons of the justices of the peace, who decided whether or no neighborhood whispering and rumors should be followed up. But the king's most direct influence was in the passing of a new law. His first parliament had been in session but 8 days when steps were taken by the House of Lords towards strengthening the statute against witchcraft. The law in force, passed in the 5th year of Elizabeth's reign, imposed the death penalty for killing by witchcraft, and a year's imprisonment for injuring by witchcraft or by allied means. James would naturally feel that this law was merely one version of the statute against murder and did not touch the horrible crime of contract with the devil and the keeping of imps. Here was a sin beside which the taking of life was a light offence. It was needful that those who were guilty of it should suffer the severest penalty of the law, even if they had not caused the loss of a single life. It was to remedy this defect in the criminal code that a new statute was introduced. The bill went to a large committee that included 6 earls and 12 bishops. Perhaps the presence of the bishops was an evidence that witchcraft was still looked upon as a sin rather than as a crime. It was a matter upon which the opinion of the Church had been received before and might well be accepted again. It was further arranged that the Lord Chief Justice of the Common Pleas, Sir Edmund Anderson, and the Attorney General, the later so famous Sir Edward Coke, along with other eminent jurists, were to act with the committee. The committee seems to have found enough to do. At any rate, the proposed statute underwent revision. Doubtless the Privy Council had a hand in the matter. Indeed, it is not unlikely that the bill was drawn up under its direction. On the 9th of June, about 2 months and a half after its introduction, the statute passed its final reading in the Lords. It repealed the statute of Elizabeth's reign and provided that
anyone who shall use, practice or exercise any invocation or conjuration of any evil and wicked spirit, or shall consult, covenant with, entertain, employ, feed, or reward any evil and wicked spirit to or for any intent or purpose, or take up any dead man, woman, or child, to be employed or used in any manner of witchcraft should suffer death as a felon.
The law explains itself. Not only the killing of people by the use of evil spirits, but even the using of evil spirits in such a way as actually to cause hurt was a capital crime. The second clause punished white magic and the intent to hurt, even where it be not affected, by a year's imprisonment and the pillory. It can be easily seen that one of the things which the framers of the statute were attempting to accomplish in their somewhat awkward wording was to make the fact of witchcraft as a felony depend chiefly upon a single form of evidence, the testimony to the use of evil spirits. We have seen why people with James's convictions about contracts with the devil might desire to rest the crime upon this kind of proof. It can be readily understood, too, how the statute would work in practice. Hitherto it had been possible to arraign a witch on the accusations of her neighbors, but it was not possible to send her to the gallows unless some death in the vicinity could be laid to her charge. The community that hustled a suspicious woman to court was likely to suffer the expense of her imprisonment for a year. It had no assurance that it could be finally rid of her. Under the new statute, it was only necessary to prove that the woman made use of evil spirits, and she was put out of the way. It was a simpler thing to charge a woman with keeping a familiar than to accuse her of murder. The stories that the village gossips gathered in their rounds had the keeping of familiars for their central interest. It was only necessary to produce a few of these gossips in court and the woman was doomed. To be sure, this is theory. The practical question is, not how would the law operate, but how did it operate? This brings us again into the dangerous field of statistics. Now, if we may suppose that the witch cases known to us are a safe basis of comparison, the reign of James, as has already been intimated, shows a notable increase in witch executions over that of Elizabeth. We have records of between 40 and 50 people who suffered for the crime during the reign of James, all but one of them within the first 15 years. It will be seen that the average per year is nearly double that of the executions known to us in the first part of Elizabeth's rule, and of course several times that of those known in the last part. This increased number we are at once inclined to assign to the direct and indirect influence of the new king. But it may very fairly be asked whether the new statute passed at the king's suggestion had not been in part responsible for the increased number. This question can be answered from an examination of those cases where we have the charges given. Of 37 such cases in the reign of James I, where the capital sentence was given, 17 were on indictments for witchcraft that had not caused death. In the other 20 cases, the accused were charged with murder. This means that over 2/5 of those who are known to have been convicted under the new law would have escaped death under the Elizabethan statute. With all due allowance for the incompleteness of our statistics, it seems certain that the new law had added very considerably to the number of capital sentences. This is a sufficient comment on the effectiveness of the new law as respects its particularly novel features. A study of the character of the evidence and of the tests of guilt employed at the various trials during the reign will show that the phrasing of the law, as well as the royal directions for trying guilt, influenced the forms of accusation and the verdicts of the juries. In other words, the testimony rendered in some of the well-known trials of the reign offers the best commentary upon the statute as well as upon the Daemonology. This can be illustrated from 3 of the processes employed to determine guilt. The king had recommended the water ordeal. Up to this time it had not been employed in English witch cases, so far as we know. The first record of its use was in 1612, 9 years after James ascended the English throne. In that year there was a discovery of witches at Northampton. 8 or 9 women were accused of torturing a man and his sister and of laming others. One of them was, at the command of a justice of the peace, cast into the water with her hands and feet bound, but could not sink to the bottom by any means. The same experiment was applied to Arthur Bill and his parents. He was accused of bewitching a Martha a Spine. His father and mother had long been considered witches. But the matter remaining doubtful that it could not be clearly tried upon him, he and his parents were tied with their thumbs and great toes, across and thrown into the water. The suspicion that was before not well grounded was now confirmed. These are the only instances given us by the records of James's reign where this test was employed by the authorities. But in the very next year after the Northampton affair it was used in the adjoining county of Bedford by private parties. A landowner who had suffered ills, as he thought, from 2 tenants, Mother Sutton and her daughter, took matters into his own hands. His men were ordered to strip the 2 women into their smocks, to tie their arms together, and to throw them into the water. The precaution of a rope tied about their middles was useless, for both floated. This was not enough. The mother, tied toe and thumb, was thrown into the water again.
She sank not at all, but sitting upon the water turned round about like a wheel. And then being taken up, she as boldly as if she had been innocent asked them if they could do any more to her.
The use of marks as evidence was not as new as the water ordeal. But it is a rather curious thing that in the 2 series of cases involving water ordeal the other process was also emphasized. In these 2 instances it would seem as if the advice of the Daemonology had been taken very directly by the accusers. The remarkable thing, however, is that in the most important trial of the time, that at Lancaster in 1612, there was an utter absence, at least so far as the extant record goes, of female juries or of reports from them. This method of determining guilt was not as yet widely accepted in the courts. The evidence of the use of evil spirits, against which the statute of the first year of James had been especially framed, was employed in such a large proportion of trials that it is not worth while to go over the cases in detail. The law forbade to take up any dead person or the skin, bone, or other part thereof for use in witchcraft. Presumably some instance of this form of witchcraft had been responsible for the phrase, but we have on record no case of the sort until a few years after the passage of the statute. It was one of the principal charges against Joanna Harrison of Royston in 1606 that the officers found in her possession all the bones due to the anatomy of man and woman. This discovery brought out other charges and she was hanged. At the famous Lancashire trials in 1612 the arch-witch Chattox was declared to have had in her possession 3 scalps and 8 teeth. She was guilty on other counts, but she escaped the executioner by dying in prison. These are illustrations of the point that the Daemonology and the Statute of James find their commentary in the evidence offered at the trials. It goes without saying that these illustrations represent only a few of the forms of testimony given in the courts. It may not, therefore, be amiss to run over some other specimens of the proof that characterized the witch trials of the reign. The requirement that the witch should repeat certain words after the justice of the peace was used once in the reign of James. It was an unusual method at best. A commoner form of proof was that adduced from the finding or seeing clay or waxen images in the possession of the accused. The witness who had found such a model on the premises of the defendant or had seen the defendant handling it, jumped readily to the conclusion that the image represented some individual. If it should be asked how we are to account for this sort of evidence, the answer is an easy one. Every now and then in the annals of witchcraft it came out that a would-be accuser had hidden a waxen or clay figure in the house of the person he wished to accuse and had then found it. No doubt some cases started in this way. No doubt, too, bitter women with grudges to satisfy did experiment with images and were caught at it. But this was rare. In the greater number of cases the stories of images were pure fabrications. Somewhat akin to the evidence from apparitions was that from the effect of a witch's glance. This is uncommonly rare in English witchcraft, but the reign of James offers 2 instances of it. In Royston, Hertfordshire, there was an honest fellow and a boon companion. One day when he was drinking with 4 companions, Joanna Harrison came in and stood gloating upon them. He went home and at once fell sick. At Northampton, the 12-year-old Hugh Lucas had looked stark upon Jane Lucas at church and gone into convulsions when he returned home. One other form of proof demands notice. In the trial of Janet Preston at York, it was testified that the corpse of Mr. Lister, whom she was believed to have slain by witchcraft, had bled at her presence. The judge did not overlook this in summarizing the evidence. It was one of 3 important counts against the woman. Indeed it was, quoting the judge, of more consequence than all the rest. Of course Mistress Preston went to the gallows. It was during the reign of this king that New England began to be settled. The settlers were his subjects, and with them came the superstitions common to the people of England,